I'm going to talk about the feasibility of switching to solar power, getting off fossil fuels, and to reduce global warming. I'm going to tell you what I read, and I'm going to speak about the United States. So basically, there's three aspects in terms of fossil fuels or CO2 production. You're going to have automobiles, you're going to have power plants, and you're going to have private industry that pollutes. For power plants, around 60%, I don't know the exact number, but it was in that range of the power plants, around 60% of our electricity produces CO2 emissions. And obviously, almost all cars do. And nuclear power doesn't. And the amount of solar in the United States is less than 1%. So someone said, well, what happens if every car became electric? No, we'll start with E85. If every car became E85, E85 still has carbon emissions, and it would only reduce carbon emissions by 30%, and it wouldn't really have an impact. That's 30% for cars only. But when you talk about CO2 emissions for the United States, you're only talking about a handful of percentage points. So it has switching to E85 does not solve global warming or CO2 emissions. Switching to electric for automobiles, for cars, it would reduce CO2 emissions. However, all of that would have to switch to electric production from power plants, which is mostly fossil fuels. And the number that I saw said that if everybody had an electric car, because it's still coming from oil power plants and coal power plants, it would only reduce CO2 emissions by a few percent. And there's many reasons why. It's because we have to produce more energy from these power plants. And you'd have to upgrade, and there's a cost involved, which means you'd have to upgrade all the power lines to handle all the extra energy, the infrastructure. So then there's another option, which is, well, what if you take all the power plants and make them all solar? Now, keep in mind, less than 1% of our power comes from solar power. If you did that, you would use up almost 1% of America's land for those solar panels. And there's two types of solar panels, one of which is primarily produced in China. So China could actually earn trillions of dollars. Like, a lot of money could actually end up in China if we switch to this. The cost, the numbers that I saw were $20 to $30 trillion, and that's presuming that they don't have government mismanagement. And our current IRS budget, the taxes in the budget, it's in the $4 trillion to $5 trillion range right now, I believe, annually. So we really don't have the money to pay for it. And the other point that was made, if you switch to solar power, you have to pay for it all up front. You don't have to do that with a car, for example. You could replace a portion of cars at a time and pay as you go. But with solar power, you can't do that. So you have to borrow the money, and then you'd also have to pay interest on that money. So the costs really skyrocket. You're talking about $20 to $30 trillion. And then what's the global impact of the U.S. going solar? People were saying 5% of global CO2 emissions would be reduced. So this is a difficult problem to solve. It's not easy. And I obviously support solar power. There is a third option. There is another option, which is that people put solar panels on their houses. That would double the cost. If everybody did that in the U.S., it would be double the cost, which would mean $50 or $60 trillion, because those panels are less efficient. So then the final solution is that there's something called a carbon capture device. When I was younger, they called it a scrubber. And it's a device that's put on a power plant to capture the carbon, and they actually take the carbon and they bury it in the ground. And I didn't read anything about the costs of these devices, but they can reduce up to 90% of the emissions from a power plant. And when 60% of your power is from a power plant that pollutes, that's a lot of carbon. And that's probably the cheapest thing that we can do. Like I said, switching to electric cars doesn't solve the problem. Switching to E85 as a fuel source solves some of the problem, but these carbon capture devices really seem like they might work. And imagine if we had it in a car. every car could have its own carbon capture device, and you probably have a small amount of carbon, and once in a while, maybe once a year, you bury it in the ground or go to a place that takes care of it or whatever. So I believe that the carbon capture device is the best solution. It can be done one power plant at a time. E85, you need the vehicles and you need the fuel and you need retail. So you need the production and you need the food, the source. You need somebody to grow the food. You need someone to refine it. You need a retail outlet, and you need the car to run on E85. So there's a lot of industries involved. Can we produce enough food? That's one of the things I forgot to look up. Is it possible for us to grow enough food for everybody to run E85? I don't know. What I do know is General Motors is one of the largest producers of E85 vehicles. Almost every one of their vehicles is available in E85. There's an additional cost to making a car E85. A regular car, the difference between a regular car and E85 is that E85 has parts that do not corrode with the E85 fuel, and it has a different timing for the electronics. They cost a lot more. You spend like $1,000 more. I'm sure that cost could come down. Okay, so if you have any questions or comments, please post below.